training session on systems thinking and introduction. So this is being recorded. It's being live streamed onto YouTube for those who can't make it. I'm just letting people in now, but let's start away. We're talking about systems thinking, and this is based upon our series of guides, right? So our series of 21 guides on systems innovation, all the ideas, methods, tools, and so forth. You'll find those on our website. We're on the third one at this stage. We've done systems innovation, and last month we did systems awareness. We had a training session there, and this week we're talking about this one on systems thinking and systems theory. So you'll find it here. This guide here, you'll find it on our website, and I'll give you the link now. We're going to be working a little bit on our mirror board, so I'll share that with you in the chat, and you can jump in here. So this is the guide here on systems theory, and you can find it by clicking on it there and clicking on that link, and it'll take you to the website. And here it is. It's the PDF. You'll be able to download it afterwards and take a look at all of that. There's also a Canvas, systems thinking Canvas, that we'll be looking at today. It's for running workshops and so forth. You'll get a little intro into that at the same time. So you can find that on the website also. So we're still collecting people here, but let's get started. We're talking systems thinking, as I said, and what is systems thinking? So we're in an introduction here, very basic level. We want to start from the beginning. What is systems thinking? It's quite an abstract subject, so there's a lot of different kind of interpretations to it. But if we start from the beginning, we can think about systems thinking as a paradigm. It's a way of thinking, right? So systems thinking is about thinking, and it's about thinking in systems. So if we start from the beginning, we can think about it as a way of thinking or a paradigm. So a paradigm, we might say, is a worldview. It's a way of looking at the world. I'll just lock this down. And so system theory is often called an alternative paradigm. Before we can start to expand upon it, we need to understand what we mean by paradigm first. A paradigm is a model, perspective, or set of ideas that forms a worldview, underlining the theories and methodologies of a particular area. Another way of thinking about it is as a culture. Cultures are really kind of paradigms, right? They're ways of looking at the world, kind of all-encompassing way that we see the world, the way that we contextualize and understand the framework through which we understand things. They often engender a lot of kind of unquestioned assumptions that we're not aware of until we're kind of exposed to other paradigms and other mental models. We see that with our cultures, right? It's not until we go to another culture, we go to East Asia or somewhere, that we really start to recognize that we have a lot of assumptions, a lot of underlining models and concepts built into our way of viewing the world, and they kind of shape everything, our way of looking at things. This is what we mean by a paradigm, right? It's a worldview. And then we can talk about systems thinking as an alternative paradigm. Well, then what's an alternative to, right? This is one good way of trying to understand something and understand it in contrast to another. So that other way of looking at the world, we call that a mechanistic paradigm or reductionist paradigm. We'll be talking quite a bit about reductionism today. This is mechanistic paradigm. I think the term itself gives you a little sense as what this is about. And this is known to be the kind of dominant paradigm in our modern world, particularly in Western culture, since the rise of modern science some 400 or 500 years ago. So the traditional paradigm taken within modern science, and by extension, the modern world, is what we call the Newtonian mechanistic paradigm. So Newton kind of fleshed this out and gave it the greatest kind of coherence some 400 years ago, but it really dominates in our modern way of looking at the world now. So it's this kind of framework for a fixed, orderly, predictable, and deterministic universe, where all events are driven by the linear interactions of discrete components of matter, creating a mechanistic view of the world. So as we'll talk about, it's reductionist, right? It's kind of reducing things down to individual parts and their interactions. In this paradigm, the universe is seen to be predictable. It's kind of like a big mechanical clock. And it continues ticking along like a perfect machine with the turning of its gears, governed by the laws of physics, making every aspect of the machine perfectly orderly, knowable, and predictable. Within this paradigm, we can understand and know this whole machine of the universe by understanding all of the parts and their simple linear interactions. So that's kind of talking a little bit in the context of science and how this kind of mechanistic idea came to dominate within modern science, and then by extension over the next few hundred years, kind of the rest of how we organize ourselves and look at the world in our modern way of being. We now apply this to engineering, to management, and how we do education, how we do everything. We'll talk more specifically about what it is, but that's what we mean by the kind of reductionist paradigm. And systems thinking is an alternative to that. So by the second half of the 20th century, with changes in science, culture, and society, a new paradigm was gradually being formulated. This new paradigm we call the systems paradigm. Systems paradigm is a set of basic concepts and axioms that form the worldview or perspective underlying systems thinking. The systems paradigm is characterized as being holistic, meaning that it always refers to the whole system or environment as the most appropriate frame of reference for understanding something. So that's a lot what we'll talk about today, holism as a way of understanding systems thinking, and what contrasts it to the reductionist approach, which is a partial one. So systems thinking is based on a synthetic way of reasoning. So let's just flick forwards because we'll be talking about that as we go along. That's very generally this idea of a paradigm, right? And there's these two different paradigms in the world, the reductionist analytical paradigm and the synthetic holistic paradigm of systems thinking. And we'll be exploring what that means as we go along today. But we might firstly want to ask why we're interested in this. What's the value of this? What's wrong with just not being what's wrong with being a reductionist thinker all the time? Why do we need systems thinking? So the primary aim of systems thinking is to elevate our thinking from just seeing parts and linear interactions to seeing and understanding whole complex systems. In our everyday way of being, we largely just see events, things, actions, and reactions. Rarely does our thinking extend to seeing the broader systems that those events form part of. Although our thinking is often piecemeal, the reality of the world we live in is complex, messy, and interconnected. Systems thinking helps to illuminate how a complex world really works. If we are to ever gain a deeper understanding, a deeper, more comprehensive understanding of the complexity of the real world, it will involve thinking in systems. By becoming aware of the systems we form part of, the consequences of our actions within that broader context, we can start to act from a different place as individuals, as organizations, as societies, and from this start to overcome the unintended consequences of a partial view of the world. So systems thinking is going to help us look at the whole, right? It's holistic. That's the main aim here, and see the whole system we form part of. We can start then to act from that, and hopefully be able to guide and develop systems as a whole instead of taking this partial approach, which leads to unintended consequences. And you've probably heard of this parable. I think we talked about it last time. The elephant and the blind man, each person just seeing their part of the elephant, their kind of individual part, and no one's seeing the whole elephant. And it's going to be very difficult actually for us to do anything together as organizations, as societies, if we don't have a kind of shared understanding of the reality we're dealing with. So systems thinking is hopefully going to elevate our thinking to see the whole elephant, to put those parts together and see the bigger picture of the whole and how they interrelate. And when we do that, we can start to think about how the different parts and the different people seeing the different parts might interrelate and be able to work together. So that's that. I'll stay going here. That's the paradigm aspect of it, right? The really broad thing. This is a kind of way of looking at the world, and it's in contrast to the reductionist approach. Within that way of looking at the world is a process of reasoning, both within the reductionist approach and the holistic systems approach, right? So this is how we go about deriving knowledge and looking at and trying to understand the world when we are within one of those paradigms. When we're within the reductionist paradigm, we use an analytical approach of reasoning and thinking about the world. When we're in a systems holistic perspective, we use a synthetic reasoning to try and derive reason and to try and derive knowledge and understand the world we live in. So let me just dig in a little bit as to what I mean by analysis and synthesis. So analysis is based on the premise that our basic unit of analysis, unit of interest should be the individual parts of the system. Analysis is the process of breaking down or reducing systems to their constituent parts and then describing the whole system primarily as simply the sum of those constituent elements. Right, so this is reductionism. This is what we do when we try to understand something within a reductionist paradigm. This is what scientists do, right? They take things into labs and they break them down and they try to study the parts, as you'll see down here in the linear interactions. This approach is deeply intuitive to us. If we look at a child playing, they'll quite often take things apart, right? If you give them something, first thing they'll do is try and pull it apart to try and understand it. When we wish to understand how a car or a bird works, the first thing we do is isolate it. Right? This is the reductionist approach. We take it into the lab or the garage or wherever it is. We break it down into its constituent parts. We analyze it. Analysis is often described in terms of a three-step process. So this is kind of what we're doing when we do reductionism or analysis. So a lot of this, what I'm talking about here, is coming from Russell Ackoff, who's a famous systems thinker back in the 20th century. And this is how he talks about analysis and reductionism as kind of a three-step process. First thing we do is isolate what we're trying to study. And then when we want to analyze, with analysis, when we wish to understand something, we take it into a controlled environment and decompose it into its parts, like in the garage, like in the lab, wherever it is. Once broken down into the elements, we then analyze those individual components in isolation to describe the properties of the parts, how it functions individually. And then we recombine them through linear interactions. The original system now tries to describe the whole in terms of the properties of the individual parts and their interactions. And that's analysis. It doesn't really take any account of the whole system. It's describing the whole as some combination of all the parts. And that's what reductionism does. When you're breaking things down, you study the properties of the parts. That's not what we do in systems thinking. We do something different. We do synthetic reasoning, which is reasoning upwards. It's asking what happens not when we take things apart, but when we put them together, right? And what's going to emerge as a whole when we put things together instead of breaking them apart. So this is Russell Ackoff again. He talks about how synthesis works. We take a kind of crude look at the whole, right? The first step in the process is to identify the overall system or environment that the entity of interest is part of. We then we try to get a broad outline of how this whole system functions through its network of connections. And then lastly, we try to understand how the parts are interconnected and arranged to function within the entirety. So we've got a whole ecosystem, and there are processes going on in that whole ecosystem, and that creates opportunities, little niches, right, where creatures can exist and perform some function within those niches, within that overall system. So it's holistic. It's looking at the whole and it's asking how do the parts interrelate to form the whole instead of analysis, which is taking things apart. So one interesting aspect of that is that analysis is very good at telling us, obviously we need both of these, right? Both of them are valid. If you want to understand something properly, you're going to need both ways of looking at it. Analysis is going to help us understand the internal workings of something, how it actually works, how it does what it does. Synthesis isn't very good at that. It's going to tell us why it does what it does, what's its function in the broader environment. So both analysis and synthesis provide very different insights. While analysis reveals the structure of the system and how it works, synthetic thinking reveals why it behaves as it does. So this is Russell Ackoff again. He gives the example of the Spanish automobile. He says, no amount of analysis of the Spanish automobile would reveal why they drive on the right side of the road. Why this happens is a historical contingent explained only by the broader evolutionary context within which the car exists. So you can tell a lot of things about the car by opening up the hood and looking inside it. You can tell how it works. If you want to understand how the car works, the engine, the fuel, and so forth, how it moves, you want to open up the hood, you want to look inside, and you want to do analysis that an engineer, that a mechanic would do. You figure out all the cogs and all the connections and so forth. But if you understand why, if you want to understand why they drive on the right-hand side of the road in Spain, no matter looking inside the car is ever going to tell you that. You're only ever going to understand that through the relationship between the car, and it's more of a social, the car in relation to the social system and the broader environment it forms part of. So whereas analysis, whereas an analytical inquiry may give a detailed insight into the internal workings of something and thus an understanding of how it functions, it is also argued that reductionist approaches do not allow us to identify why behavior happens. Synthesis resolves this by referring to the broader context. Synthesis helps us to understand the meaning of something because the meaning of something is in its function within the broader system. Right? So why this bird is like this is both a function of its internal workings, but also a function of its relationship within the broader ecosystem. So yeah, I want you guys to jump in now and let's do a little exercise. Try and get ourselves thinking in systems. I'm on this board here with the bird. If you could please join me. I'll share the link again for those who are just coming now. We want to start thinking in these two different ways. There's the link, please join. Up here, we've got stickies for a reductionist way of looking at this bird. I gave you some examples already of the birds and stuff over there and different ways of looking at this. Maybe you'd like to share what you think would be a reductionist way of looking at this bird, of understanding that bird. And equally, you can grab a green one here if you have ideas about a holistic way of looking at that bird and post up those. And what kind of knowledge would we derive? How would we understand it from a holistic perspective? How would we understand it from a reductionist perspective? Does anybody need help? Everybody know how to use Miro? You can also get a sticky on the left-hand side here. Just choose the right color. And please scale your stickies to the appropriate size. Could we please scale down? Yep, scale down your stickies so that they're a reasonable size and make sure they're the right color, either orange for a reductionist view or green for a holistic view. For those who have just joined, we're working on our mirror board here. I'll share the link again. We're talking about holism and reductionism, synthesis and analysis, and trying to think about this bird from the different perspectives. What would it look like if we're taking a reductionist perspective? Those are the orange stickies, and the green ones are for what it would look like if we were taking a holistic perspective. We'll just take 1 or 2 more minutes to post a few more things up there, and then we'll stay going. Okay, we've got quite a bit to cover today, so I'm going to jump into some of these quickly. So these are the reductionist ways of looking at this bird, some of the kind of insights we might derive. What is the structure of its feathers? Okay, do we think that's a holistic way of looking? I'm not sure, because we're still kind of looking internally to the bird, aren't we? We're studying the thing itself, rather than a holistic way is going to put it in the context of its environment and its interaction between others. So how feathers give lift? Yeah, potentially, because that's a relationship between it and its environment, the atmosphere. How feathers work, gender and associated behavior, aerodynamics of the bird's body. Okay, anatomy of the wings. Oh, sorry, these are reductionist ones, excuse me. Yeah, so we're on the orange ones. It's the reductionist ones. Okay, flying things, has body and wings. Yeah, moves around. Okay, does it think? Reductionism, the amount of food it eats in grams, how does it fly? Yeah, so we get kind of quantitative, don't we, with this analytical way of the world, looking at the world pretty quickly. And we start studying the parts. How much food does it eat? How fast does it flap its wings? How much does it weigh, and so forth? So we can quite quickly get kind of quantitative on this. Shape of the beak. Okay, and let's look at some of the holistic ways of looking at this. The food web, energy transfer. Yes, exactly, very good. This thing's part of a broader network of energy, the metabolism really within an ecosystem, and it's one little niche in that broader system. And it's providing some function, it's being able to capture energy, and it's transforming it and forming part of a larger food web. Birds' effects on environments, other animals, integrates in the environment. Yep, lives in urban areas in groups, small size of hummingbirds, helps it to be, of the hummingbird, helps it to be sustained, its nectar only diet, okay? Stay stable so it can survive, survey its environment and find food. Other living and not living beings it lives with, yeah. What does it eat? Interact with air. What kind of air? Okay, very good. Communicates with other birds, yep. So you get the idea, right? Analysis is going to drill down, look inside that system. And holism is going to look at its relationship with its environment. So one point there is that we talked about separating the thing from its environment. And the reason it does that, we do that with analysis. We take the bird into the lab and we study its anatomy, right? And that's how we describe bird through a reductionist approach. It's trying to hold that system constant, right? Not changing. When it's in its environment, it's constantly changing, right? It's interacting with other things. The air is changing, the weather's changing, it's moving around, other creatures are coming and going. So you can't actually understand it very well internally if it's in a dynamic state interacting with its environment. So we always take it into the lab or somewhere like this. In economics, they ceteris paribus, which means all other things being equal. That's one word you'd hear in science quite a bit, a Greek word. And they're trying to hold everything in the environment constant so that you can study the internal workings. In the systems approach, we're not doing that, right? Because we're not particularly interested in the internal workings. Actually, that approach is much more dynamic. We're asking, how is this thing interacting with its environment, with other creatures, so on and so forth. And we'd actually wouldn't take it into the lab. We'd go out there into the ecosystem and we'd look at it more like an ecologist or something like this. And we'd say, okay, how does it move around in that environment? How does it respond? How does it adapt to changes, so on and so forth? It's a more dynamic way of looking at it. And actually, one other thing to note is that when we do analysis on this thing, this bird, first thing we do is actually kill it, right? What a scientist would do if they wanted to study the anatomy of this thing, they'd take it into the lab and chop it up, and actually it would die. And if you're doing synthetic thinking, that you'd lose all the information you wanted, right? Because this thing exists in an ecosystem, it's a living system. And if you took it into a lab and chopped it up, you're going to lose the most important thing about it. You're not going to understand it as a living system and in relation to all these other living systems. So I think you get the idea there. Let's, hopefully you do anyway. Let's stay going. I'm sorry, I'm not sure we're going to be able to take many questions today. We've got quite a large group, and we want to get through quite a bit. So this is what we're going to look at, right? 4 different dimensions to systems thinking that are going to help us shift our thinking from a partial view of the world to a more holistic view. So the first one here is going to be about parts and whole. Second one, we're going to talk about reductionism and emergence. And then down here, hopefully we get to some of this, talk about the difference between linear thinking and nonlinear thinking. And then finally, a bit about relational thinking and network thinking, as opposed to this kind of disconnected view of the world. So those are 4 things we're going to look at. Firstly, this idea of whole and parts. So this is Russell Ackoff again. He makes this interesting. He was an architect, and he gives a really good example of the architect's kind of challenges in developing a building, maybe a house like this. He talks about the architect as kind of a holistic thinker. The architect is considered a holistic discipline, or architecture, as it is primarily concerned with the whole building's workings. Rather than prioritizing any single element to the building, the architect must look at how all of the parts interrelate to form the whole system. At the end of the day, they're responsible for the whole system, right? So the architect is not like the mechanical engineering or the people who are going to come and put in these windows here, right? The people who come and fit in the windows, they're only really interested in the windows. The architect is interested in the whole, right? So her or his job is actually one of a relationship between the parts and the whole, because they've got to get all these parts working together to deliver a functioning building, a functioning environment that's going to provide that function of a living space. And that's not going to be one thing. It's not going to be great windows that are going to make a good living environment here. It's going to be good windows, but it's also going to be good doors and good, lovely floor and heating system and insulation in the attic and making sure there's water and electricity and so on and so forth. And the architect's got to think about all of that. They've got to think about the parts. Where's the best place to put this window? They've got to consider that. How heavy should the door be? How much insulation do we really want in the roof? They've got to consider all these things, but they've got to understand them in relation to everything else. And they're making a kind of a dynamic trade-off between all these things, right? If this window is going here and it's very nice there, then maybe we can't have another window right there on the corner or something. Or because of the structural features of this building, we can't put a window there because it wouldn't be strong enough. So they're making trade-offs. They're looking at the whole. Ultimately, they have to optimize the whole, right? Because the people who buy this building, they don't want a great door and then everything else is terrible, it's going to fall to bits. They want a great building, and that's the architect's job. They want everything in that building to be great, and they want it to be working together really well. So the architect's kind of juggling or balancing this interplay between the parts and the whole, as opposed to, as I say, maybe some engineer who comes in and looks at one part. Maybe the plumber, right? The plumber comes in and they're interested in the plumbing, right? They're not interested in other aspects of this building, the heating or whatever. So they're taking something of a partial view in some sense, the plumber and these other people, the people who are putting the chimney in and people who are putting the floor in. But this architect has to consider the whole and the parts at the same time. So that's why he's arguing that the architect is a holistic discipline. In contrast to the building engineer, building engineers are required for the analysis and design of the physical parts to ensure that it will function. Each engineer can focus on their specific domain with less consideration of the whole. That's in contrast to the architect. So I hope that kind of illustrates what we're talking about when we talk about this. If you listen to systems thinkers, they spend a lot of time going on about parts and wholes, and yeah, you might wonder sometimes, why are we talking about that? But it's very, very important in every kind of system, right? There's parts and they're interrelated to form a whole system. And there's a kind of dynamic interplay between the parts and the whole. And we need to consider that. Like the individuals in a society, right? We all want our bit of freedom, but at the end of the day, we have to kind of constrain ourselves for some kind of rules, some kind of law, so that the overall society we form part of can function. When we go to work in an organization, we'd like to be able to express ourselves and do our work, but also we've got to kind of operate within some kind of guidelines that are helping the overall system to work. And there's a dynamic interplay between the two. Same for all systems. And it needs to be considered. Okay, so a reductionist approach will work well when you're just dealing with parts, right? So this here is going to be very amenable to reductionism because it's just a pile of parts. There's no special relationship between them. There's no system there, right? It's not a system. It's just a set of parts. So reductionism is going to work well because the scientist or engineer is going to come along and they're going to weigh all those stones and they're going to study their properties, and then they know everything about that pile of stones, right? There's nothing really more to know about that pile of stones than just study the mass of them, you know, the molecular makeup, so on and so forth. So reductionism will work fine. But look at this one here. This is an interesting one. It's an image I found earlier on today. Because there's a pile of parts there, right? People's hands. There's also something else, isn't there? There's an organization. The parts are put together in a special way. These parts aren't put together in any special way. They're just random. And because they're random, another point is they don't function. These stones aren't doing anything. They don't have a function like systems have functions. They do things. And to do that, like this building has a function, only going to get the function of a lovely living space if it's really well designed and well built. This pile of stones, not going to do anything for us. But systems do because of the interrelationship between the parts. So I found this interesting. It's not maybe a good example of a system, but I find it interesting because it illustrates the point that a system is really nothing more than the organization of the parts, the arrangement of the parts. And you can see that here because all we have is a pile of parts. And when we look at it, we see something extra. We see a circle. But all that circle is the way the parts are organized. It's a pattern of organization. There's no atoms or anything there, right? That circle is just a pattern of it's the way the parts are organized. The parts have substance, they have atoms and so forth. But when we organize them in a particular way, we get the emergence of something extra, something more than the sum of the parts, a circle. If it wasn't organized in that way, we'd just have a random set of hands. But we got the emergence of a circle. And then there's a dynamic relationship between that whole and the parts. People have to have their hands in the right place to get that whole, because it's a particular type of organization, that circle. Okay, hope you join me again, and we'll do a little bit of thinking, more holistic thinking, partial thinking on the left here, and holistic thinking about city, this one here. Please grab a sticky and exercise your imagination, exercise your new learning around systems and reductionist thinking. I'll share the link again for newcomers. Okay, I'm going to jump in and take a look now. I just want to take a look at some of the comments in the chat. There's some good ones here. Brian seems reductionism can also be more tangible, more concrete, while systems perspective synthesized in more conceptual. It is, isn't it? Because we talked about it there in terms of this here, right? We saw the systems thing is nothing concrete, really. It's nothing tangible. All the tangible things are the elements, the hands. The system is actually something very intangible. It's just a pattern. It's just an organization. But the point is that it still affects hugely, affects us hugely. We can't look at that image without not seeing a circle there, right? It affects our perception. So just because it's intangible doesn't mean that it doesn't have a huge influence. Okay, so Jan Van Bon also says, essentially none of the parts can deliver the functioning of the whole. Yeah, great point, right? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Emergence, it's going to be more than the sum of its parts. Okay, can we reduce our stickies down to an appropriate level, please? So the reductionist ones, looking at this city, from the perspective of a reductionist approach on the left here, cars, shops, parks, cars. So we're talking about individual things, road markings, natural resources, roads, yeah, businesses, individual interests, humidity level. Yeah, it's just a pile of kind of series or a pile of parts. Let me get rid of that. When we take a reductionist perspective, right, we describe the thing as simply a set of parts, right? Road, car, so on and so on. We don't actually understand it as a whole, like international politics or the international political environment. We describe it as a bunch of countries, 200 countries or however many. We don't think that there's actually anything else there more than just a bunch of countries. In this city, how could it be anything except for all the different parts, the cars, the shops, the trees, so on and so forth. But we can see over here, it can be, right? This here, we're going to talk about now in a minute. This part of parts, but there's something extra there. Also, this is kind of a system, a circle. So we know there can be, and let's see what you put up here. Governance, identity, greenery, global warming impact, accessibility, water needs and distribution. Because accessibility is kind of a relational thing, isn't it? It's a relationship between, it's not a thing in itself. It's not a building. It's not an element. It's a relationship between different things, isn't it? And it's a relationship of how we're using the system. Communities, it's a relational thing. Water flows and systems, sense of community. Yep. CO2 absorption, efficiency, pollution. I'm not sure about pollution. Pollution would probably be on the other side, I think. Pollution is kind of a thing, isn't it? Energy distribution versus needs, urban planning. Quality of life is a very holistic thing, I think, actually, because if you think about it, it's not one thing, right? It's many things. It takes a lot of things to get quality of life. It takes a whole environment, a whole context, a whole functioning system really to get there. So I think it's a good example of the kind of holistic way of looking at it. Climate of a city, place where people live, move around. Yep. Business deals, flow of traffic, cleanliness of city air. Okay, great. Let's stay going. So next thing we'll talk about here is, I was talking about the parts and the whole. Here we're going to talk about reductionism and emergence. So reductionism breaks things down, and emergence does the opposite. It's about how new things emerge when we put them together, like those hands. When we put them together in the right way, we got the emergence of a circle that didn't exist before, and none of those hands could really create that circle. So what is reductionism? Reductionism is a practice of analyzing and describing a complex phenomena in terms of its elementary parts that exist on a simpler or more fundamental level, right? So we see this in science. We know how modern science has developed. They've been going downwards, right? They had an organism, then they studied its organs, and then they studied the tissues in those organs, and then they started studying the molecular level, the cells, all the way down to the molecules, the atoms, and now we're going down, right? Subatomic particles. So, and we're looking for the kind of theory of everything right down there in the individual parts. Those atoms we thought would describe everything, and now we're kind of drilling down further into quarks and strings and so forth. And that's really kind of the enterprise here of reductionism. Stay breaking the system down, because it's the obvious thing to do. If you want to understand something, you break it up and you look at the parts and you stay going down until you think you've got the most basic things, and you describe the whole as some combination of those parts. One problem with that is that you actually lose sight of the whole system as you do it, right? If there's anything happening up here as a whole system, you're going to lose sight of that pretty quickly, because you're spending your time breaking it apart. And when you break it apart, it's not going to have those whole system properties and so forth that we call emergence, emergent features and so forth. So reductionism attempts to describe a unified description of the world through reducing it to a set of elementary components through which any phenomena can be explained as some summation, some kind of linear combination of those parts. So the higher level features of the system can be largely ignored within this inquiry. That's the kind of premise, allowing us to focus on the lower level parts that constitute it. So you think about biology, actually, right? The way we've gone with biology, if you ask a biologist what life is, it's interesting, they probably won't be able to tell you, or they give you some kind of molecular kind of description of what that's about. They wouldn't really be able to tell you what it's really like, because that's actually an emergent higher level feature of when we put things together in the right way, which is not what we're studying in a reductionist approach to biology. We kind of drill downwards. So, for example, this approach to understanding cognition, this reductionist approach, would attempt to reduce high-level cognitive phenomena such as awareness, emotions, concept to basic physical building blocks of the brain, neurons and synapses. And they would kind of say, a reductionist neuroscience or whatever would say, well, the brain is nothing more than these neurons and synapses. How could it be anything more than the neurons and synapses? So they try and describe everything with reference to those little building blocks. Of course, if you did that to an organization, it would end up like this, and we see a few of those around here. So we get the idea. It is very dominant, this approach in our world. Think about what a university looks like. Universities full of business, different schools and departments. It's actually highly reductionist, the kind of university, the way it divides everything into different departments and different subjects and so forth. And actually, you can go to the university and they'll teach students a whole pile of different subjects. There's no actual kind of understanding and awareness of the whole kind of learning experience that the student's getting, actually, as a whole. It's all kind of divided up into different areas and different departments and so forth. Organizations are likewise, and this creates a lot of issues in our world. So there's also a different way, right? This idea of emergence here. How many people have heard of emergence? Put your hand up if you know what emergence is, if you're familiar with this idea. Okay, some people, not everyone. Okay. This is a really important idea here, actually. It's really one of the central ideas, because without this, well, reductionism would work perfectly fine. If there was nothing more than the sum of the parts, then reductionism would work perfectly fine. But here, this systems idea is that actually there's something more than the sum of the parts, right? Going back to that circle thing there, we put all the parts together and something new emerged because we put them together in a particular way. And that's what we're talking about here. And we're saying this thing that emerges is interesting, and we want to study it as a whole, right? Because there's actually a circle there kind of as a whole. It's not just a series of parts. If we just studied all the hands individually, well, none of them make a circle. That hand there is just a random hand hanging out, right? And by studying that hand in isolation, we're never going to understand the circle. And studying all the other hands in isolation, we've got to look at the thing as a whole if we want to see it, if we really want to see that emergent phenomena of the circle. So this is emergence. this thing here is an emergent phenomenon. Because at the end of the day, this is nothing more than carbon molecules, right? And those carbon molecules are dead. They don't live, they aren't alive. But this thing is alive. So somewhere between a big pile of carbon molecules and this thing is emergence through putting those parts together in the right way to get something new to exist as a whole. This thing exists as a whole. If we chop it up into parts, it's dead. And if you look at all those individual molecules, they're dead also. This thing as a whole is alive. So it's an emergent phenomena. Life is an emergent phenomena. And we have to study it on that level if we really want to understand it. We can only understand so much by chopping it up. Okay, so emergence is one of the central concepts within systems theory, as it describes a universal process of becoming or creation, a process whereby novel features and properties emerge when we put elementary parts together as they interact and self-organize to create new patterns of organization. Emergence, being a highly abstract concept, is literally everywhere. From the evolution of the universe to the formation of traffic jams, from the development of social movements to the flocking of birds, from the cooperation of trillions of cells giving rise to the human body, to the formation of hurricanes and financial crisis. These are all emergent phenomena. Actually, walking is something of an emergent phenomenon, because walking is what? It's two legs in motion. But if you took each one in isolation, if you just did each one in isolation, then you'd be hopping, right? There's no correlation, no relationship between the two. Then you'd hop with one leg and you'd hop with the other leg and you'd hop with the other leg. And you'd be doing something qualitatively different from walking. You coordinate your two legs when you walk. And that creates a process, the emergence of a higher level process of walking that greatly facilitates your movement. If you're trying to hop all the time with your two legs, it'd be a very bad way of moving around. Walking. So that's just an illustration of how pervasive this actually is. Anna Maria, did you want to say something, or is that your hand up from before?
It's just my hand up from before.
Okay, I stay going. You can post it in the chat if you want to say something. Emergence can be understood as a form of nonlinear pattern formation, where there's synergies. Synergies is an important idea here. We put things together and something extra is added, something more than just the parts. What each one has in isolation emerges. And the formation of distinct patterns that creates new emergent levels of organization that are driven by an evolutionary dynamic. So I think you get the idea if you look at this and the relationship between those individual parts and that whole thing. It's not a dead thing. If that was dead, that was just a pile of carbon molecules put together in any random order, it wouldn't be alive. And it would behave very differently from this thing. This thing actually grows and it's alive and it breathes and it processes energy and so forth. It's doing something very different and it processes information too. Like, where's the light coming from? It's moving towards the light. It does things as a whole that none of its parts can do. And it's radically different from its individual parts. Just like in your brain, your synapses in your brain are incredibly simple in terms of their operations. They can just be on or off, right? So a synapse, it can't have an emotion. It can't remember anything. You can't do much with an on-off switch, but millions and even billions of those put together, you can do all sorts of amazing things emerge in terms of memories, emotions, and connections and feelings and all of this stuff. So there, again, is an example of emergence. All these individual little units put together in particular ways gives you that memory of what it was like lying on the beach with your friend, listening to the sound of the sea 5 years ago. And that's a whole experience, that's a whole thing that you experience. It's not like you just feel, oh, I just had 500,000 synapses fire in my brain in a particular way. It's very different, that sensation of lying on the beach that you experience as a whole. Same as this here. So that's what we're getting at when we talk about emergence. And that's why we need systems thinking, because that happens as a whole. And we've got to look at it as a whole. And reductionism is doing the opposite. It's saying nothing happens as a whole. we're going to break it down to parts. Everything happens as a set of parts put together in some way. But here we're saying, no amount of studying the parts will ever help you understand. If you never understood what it was like to have an emotion or a memory, and you tried to just study the neurons in the brain, you would never really understand what it was like to have a memory. You could never actually really access or experience someone else's memory just by studying all the neurons, right? It's not going to get you there. It's a very qualitatively different thing. Okay, let's stay going for the sake of time. Oh, someone's run away with the board here. Let's put this back here. Here we go. Let's think about this here. It's a social organization. Please join me on the board, and let's try and exercise our thinking again. So this is taken from the canvas. You can see them up here if you ever want to use it. The link is back at the beginning. We want to shift from, well, we want to think about what does this look like from a reductionist perspective? Oh, someone stole it again. What does it look like from a emergence perspective, a holistic way of looking at it? We're talking about this group of people. They're obviously a little team kind of working together in some way. You've got your stickies up there. Green for holistic, orange for a reductionist perspective. Please post up any ideas. I'll share the link with the newcomers. Okay, I'm going to jump in and take a look at these for the sake of time. So let's start with these ones here. Individual stakeholders. Yeah, thinking about individual people, job titles, individual interests, their clothes. Someone's debating men and women, individual opinion, individuals. Yeah, so you get this idea that one way of looking at this is just as a group of individuals, nothing more than the sum of their parts, really. The whole is just a combination of individuals, is one way of looking at that. So then, and this 15 people sat in a circle. I think that's another aspect of kind of reductionist approach. It just kind of describes things the way they are, the way it sees the parts in the system. And that's analysis. And that's kind of the way we use the word analysis to some extent. Like, we're going to analyze the financial reports of this company. You just kind of look at the details of that and you study those details. And that's all of what you're doing, really. So when we look at it from this perspective, it looks like a team, right? Somehow, what's a team? A team is something more than any of the individuals. It's a thing going on. They're functioning together, right, as a whole. And again, what one person commentated, none of the parts could function. None of the parts should be able to do what the team can do. Otherwise, it's not really a functional team. So self-organization, their conclusions after the meeting, okay, mood of participants, collaboration, knowledge sharing, listening, diversity of thought, culture, norms, collaboration, teamwork, belonging, politics, synergies, okay, decisions, brainstorming, sense making, collective sense making would be an interesting one. How are they going to make sense together of something? Work culture, the emergence of a leader there, their team meeting, sport and friendship dynamics. Okay, great. Holistic, sharing common interests, their conclusions after the meeting. All right. Okay, let's stay going. That was thinking about reductionism and holism as one aspect to this systems thinking approach or way of looking at the world. So this one here is around linear and non-linear ways of looking. So we know the reductionist approach is very linear. It normally tries to search for direct cause and effect interactions. So when you see something happen, an effect, it looks for one or a number of direct causes for that, a limited number of variables that are affecting that, like in a kind of mathematical equation. There's normally just a few variables there, and it's trying to describe a system. And this is it here, Newton's cradle, this is called. It's kind of an icon of that. This thing here, going to bang that thing, and it's going to bang that thing, and it's going to hit that. And that's the kind of mechanistic view of the world. This thing causes that. In a linear, we search for those kind of linear cause and effect relationships between everything to describe how the world works. The systems approach is a bit different. It's asking about non-linearities. So that's about not how one thing affects another, and that's the end of it, but how does one thing affect another, and then that feeds back to affect the first. Or it may even be that there's more than one or two or just three things affecting this here. It looks for potentially a wide number of things affecting the outcome. So it's moving more into the world of kind of networks here, that actually what we see, the outcome, the effect, may not be the product of some direct cause or a limited number like reductionism would say. It might actually emerge out of some context, which we could understand as a network of many different interacting variables or factors. So going back to that idea of quality of life, that, as I mentioned, it's going to actually emerge out of many, many different things. Really, to get quality of life, you need a lot of, it's affected by many things in your life, you know, your relationship and your family, and you got to have money, and you got to have mobility, and you got telecommunications, and so on and so forth. Many different things, as opposed to GDP or being rich, right? Being rich is quite a simple kind of variable. You just got to get some money. And then you'll be rich, and that's relatively simple. Or GDP is a measure of well-being. If you really want to measure well-being, it's going to be many different things. So that's the idea of non-linearity. It's not one or a few different things causing it. Reductionism, of course, is reducing things down. So it's trying to reduce everything down to just a few variables. Holism is going expansively. It's thinking, how can I actually find potentially many different variables that are affecting this and interacting in a non-linear fashion. So this is a conversation is a good example of a non-linear dynamic, particularly amongst a group, right? So it's not that one person is just affecting another and that's kind of the end of it. Actually, there's a cyclical kind of feedback dynamic going when you're having a discussion. You say something, then I respond to it, and you respond to what I said, so on and so forth. And that actually is a feedback dynamic. And when you have a group of people, that's kind of a non-linear kind of feedback network dynamic. One person saying something, another person responding to that, another person chimes in. There's high levels of kind of interdependency in this dynamic. And it's evolving over time, and it's quite unpredictable, right? You really don't know where a conversation is going to go. One person could pick up on something in a very different way to another, and it could spin off in many different directions. There's a high level of kind of unpredictability, and a certain lack of control also. You can't actually really control a conversation because it can go in many different directions. Okay, so that's the idea of nonlinearity, and potentially multiple effects for any given, multiple causes for any given effect, as opposed to this linear way of looking at the world. I'm just going to flick through the last board so that we kind of make it all the way to the end. I'm going to pass over that. We're running out of time at this stage. The last one here I wanted to talk about was connected versus disconnected. So a systems perspective is a connected, networked view of the world, a relational paradigm. The reductionist one is obviously breaking things down. So it's looking at them, as we talked about, in separation, disconnected, like with that group of people. We look at them as a group of individuals. A systems perspective, we look at them as a dynamic, a team, right? A certain dynamic between the parts, and this relational way of looking at the world, how things are interconnected into broader networks, broader patterns, and so forth. So in a general sense, a system means a configuration of parts connected by a web of interdependent relationships. When talking about systems, the emphasis is typically on connections and interdependencies as the defining feature of the organization. Systems theory fundamentally rests upon a relational view of the world. That is to say, that the connections between the parts is our primary focus, rather than focusing on the parts themselves. The relational paradigm of system thinking emphasizes how connections, interdependency, and context shape the component parts of the system, and not so much vice versa, which is not the traditional approach. So it's a lot about context, understanding that network, as I said, of interacting variables. Okay, let's maybe just, before we wrap up, we'll maybe try and think a little bit about that, this connected versus disconnected. What do we think about, how can we think about this small group of tribal people in a connected or a disconnected way? What would that look like? Please grab a sticky and post up your ideas here. What would be a kind of a networked way of looking at a group like this, as opposed to an isolated kind of component-based view of it? I'm just going to take a quick look before we wrap up. So a worldview, traditions, commonly sharing an interest, connected, they respect nature, they're part of nature, they may be part of this ecosystem in many, many different ways. Connection between father and son. So let me take a look at these ones first. Limited knowledge, isolated, not on social media, independent, self-survival, man and boy, limited knowledge, culture, traditional culture, the degree of openness to each other. Yeah, interesting one. Relationship between them. What is normal, acceptable behavior in this situ? Connection between father and son, breathing the same air as us all. Yeah, that's certainly the same oxygen on planet Earth. They're breathing as we're breathing. Interesting. Traditional culture. Father teaching boy how to survive. Family. They're in harmony with their environments. Yeah. Okay. Great. Well done, guys. I just want to flick back to the beginning so that we can recap a little bit before we wrap up here. We talked about systems thinking as a holistic way of looking at the world, right? A holistic paradigm, should we say, as opposed to the reductionist paradigm and the analytical thinking, which is breaking things down. Holistic thinking is about synthetic thinking, synthesizing things, putting them together, seeing what emerges. And we looked at the idea of the parts and the whole as one dynamic, and that house, Russell Ackoff's house, and the architect having to consider the parts and the whole, make a dynamic kind of relationship between the two, or interplay between the two. Reductionism and emergence. Reductionism, things breaking it down to this kind of hierarchical fixed kind of structure. Emergence, what happens when we put many things together and we get certain synergies, that they form another level of organization that doesn't exist at the lower level, like the living plant, or consciousness indeed is another example. Then we quickly skip through linear versus nonlinear thinking. Traditional kind of reductionist thinking is always kind of asking, what's affecting this? What are the few variables, the main variables? We forget about the weak signals or the not so important variables. We focus on a few variables, and it's kind of linear. Systems thinking is always looking at that kind of cyclical feedback dynamic, and it's asking, actually, what's the context around this? What are the many different variables within which this exists that may be influencing it, out of which it might be emerging? Okay. And then finally, we quickly touch upon kind of relational way of looking at the world, understanding things as part of a broader nexus or network of things. It's obviously going to lead us to a holistic way. Holism is always reduction is always narrowing down. It's trying to find one or two variables or a few, and it focuses on those, focuses our attention on those. Holism is always going outwards, and it's saying more, give me more, help me understand the whole network, all the interacting variables. So it's a relational, contextual way of looking at the world. All right, you guys, we wrap up there. Sorry we couldn't take questions and a discussion and everything. It's a bit too big in this group if we want to kind of make it through the content and get the learning and so forth. But it was great having you joining, and hopefully we come back next month. Actually, we'll be talking about complexity theory, and yeah, digging into more of this stuff. It's kind of an extension of systems thinking to help us better understand complexity. But let's wrap up for now, and hopefully see you again next month. Okay, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks. That was excellent.
Thank you, yes.